For hundreds of years, people in Ottoman countries have been making and eating simit for breakfast. Sure, they're a soft and fluffy bread, but it's actually their sesame-coated skin that really makes them stand out. Dip a chunk into some soft cheese, or you could scoop up some eggs, and you'll get why they're so good. Here's how to make them.
First, you put together a simple bread dough which you'll portion out and shape into the signature simit rings. After that, you dip each ring into a molasses mixture and then coat them in toasted sesame seeds before baking. We'll start off the dough by activating 7 grams of fast-acting yeast. This will make sure that the yeast is alive so you don't waste a load of ingredients on dead yeast. First, measure out 300 grams of warm water in a jug. The closer this is to 35 degrees Celsius, the faster the yeast will come alive. Add in the yeast, and then to feed it you'll add 5 grams of sugar, and then whisk that together until all of the yeast has dissolved. As the yeast hydrates, it will start feeding on the sugar and producing CO2 gas, which gives our dough plenty of rise. Set this aside for about 15 to 30 minutes, and then when the timer is up, you should have some foaminess on the surface. Fast-acting yeast won't go crazy foamy like instant or fresh yeast does, but this is enough confirmation that the yeast is alive and we can move on. To make the dough, I'm breaking out my stand mixer and attaching the dough hooks that can do the work of kneading, but it's definitely possible to make this by hand. I'll start off by adding in 500 grams of bread flour. Bread flour has 13% protein versus the usual 10% in all-purpose flour, and that extra protein makes bread stretchier and allows it to rise more. I haven't tried this using all-purpose flour, but there isn't a huge amount of rising going on, and so I suspect it will be fine. Next up, I added 15 grams of salt and gave that a quick mix with the flour to combine. We now want to incorporate the yeasty liquid, so I made a well in the centre of the flour and then poured in the liquid. Start off your mix at the lowest speed to begin combining these, and it will take a short while for the liquid to completely disappear. Once it has, you can turn the speed up slightly, and then when all the flour has come together into a dough ball, you want to start counting the minutes. You'll need this for about 8 minutes on low speed, and to test if it's ready, grab a ball of dough and stretch it. If it just snaps right away with very little stretch and it leaves dough on your hands, it needs more kneading. Right about here it was looking good. There was a good amount of stretch and the dough was nice and smooth and didn't leave any residue on my hands. So I took it out of the bowl and roughly shaped it into a ball. The dough is very stretchy right now, and we want to let this rest so the gluten can relax and the yeast can start working. So I added a drop of vegetable oil to the bowl, spread that around, and then added the dough ball back. Cover this with some plastic wrap or a kitchen towel, and then set it aside for 45 minutes so it can really rest and ferment. While it's resting, use the time to prepare the sesame and molasses that are going to give the simit its special exterior. I've got 150 grams of regular white sesame that I'm going to freshly toast so that the flavour is nice and intense. Add this to a stainless steel pan over medium heat and then start stirring constantly. Not gonna lie, this takes a while to toast. For ages it's going to look like there is no progress, and then slowly it'll start to go golden and then light brown. This is the most boring part of the whole recipe, but once it's done you can pour it out into a bowl and set it aside. Next time I might just buy some toasted sesame instead. The next thing to do is to prep the molasses, and all we're going to do is thin this out into a syrupy liquid. For simit, the traditional ingredient is pekmez, which is grape molasses, though I don't think the kind of molasses matters too much as long as it's not very bitter. You need 100 grams of molasses, and I didn't have enough grape molasses left after recipe testing, so I topped up the rest with some date molasses that I had lying around. And so that's going to be quite thick, so you'll add 50 grams of water to the molasses, and then mix that together until the molasses has thinned out. You should end up with a kind of syrupy texture that looks like this, and that's all good to go. Once the timer for the dough has gone off, the dough should have doubled in size, and then it's time to start assembling the simit. Pour the dough out onto your worktop and knock out all of the built up gas that the yeast has created. After that you're going to divide the dough into 6 pieces, each of which will become a single simit. I'm using double the amount of dough, so I'm working with half at a time, and in total I'll have 12 pieces of dough to turn into simit. Once you've divided it up into roughly equal balls, I'd recommend weighing them to get their size more uniform. The target here is 130 to 140 grams per piece, which is the standard size of simit in Turkey. When they're measured, place the balls on a tray and then cover them with a kitchen towel so they don't dry out. To shape these into the simit shape, I grab a ball of dough and flatten it out to knock out any air, and then I split that dough into 2 pieces. I'll then take each piece and roll it out into a long strand of dough by rolling it back and forth using my palms. You want this to measure about 40 centimeters once it has been stretched, and for it to have a fairly even thickness along the length. It does take a bit of practice to do this, but you should end up with 2 similar strands like this. And now comes the fun part of twisting them together. It's easiest to braid these by folding one side over the other until you get to the end of the dough, or you can hold one end down and roll it so they twist together. Regardless of what you do, it'll look like this, and then you just turn that into a ring and merge the 2 ends together. These need plenty of overlap so they don't come apart in the oven. Once you press them together, lift the dough up from the twisted side and roll the joint back and forth against the worktop until it becomes one solid piece. You'll now have a ring of dough that looks kind of like a simit. We need it to be a bit bigger, so lift the ring with one hand, and then by applying light pressure, squish the 2 strands of dough together using the palm of your other hand. Do this all the way around and it will stretch out the simit slightly and make the 2 strands of dough stick together. This is what it will end up looking like, and don't worry if it looks like the spiral shape has faded, it will come back once it's baked. The final step to preparing these is to give them their coating. First line a baking sheet with some baking paper, and then get your bowls of molasses and sesame side by side. I'd also just give the molasses a quick stir in case it has settled. Take your simit and dip it right into the molasses liquid, and flip it over so the second side is coated as well. Then move the simit out of the molasses and into the toasted sesame, and give it a good coat of sesame seeds on both sides. You don't need to press the sesame into the dough, it should just stick, and this is what it will end up looking like. Once they're coated, they need to rest for at least 10 minutes before we can bake them, and of course you need to preheat the oven. I've set this to 190 degrees Celsius with the fan on, and to give the simit a crisp crust, we need a load of steam in the oven, so I'm adding in a baking dish filled with water while the oven preheats. When the oven's ready and the simit has rested, we're going to give them one last stretch before baking. Lift them up from the sides and let gravity slightly stretch them out, then put them back on the tray. Once they're stretched, place the tray into your oven and let the simit bake for between 22 to 25 minutes. The crispier you want the skin to be, the longer you go, and once they come out of the oven they'll look like this. The twisted shape should be nicely defined and they should have a crisp skin all the way around. That crispy skin is the sign of a good simit, and these certainly deliver, plus the inside is nice and fluffy. Load them up onto a rolling pin or a dowel if you want to present them the traditional way. If you're looking for ways to eat them, fry up an egg and use the simit to scoop up the runny yolk, or add some lebanon to a bowl with some za'atar and olive oil and dip your simit in for an amazing bite. And finally, these are just as good with sweet things, so some honey will work great, and it's even better with some clotted cream.
This is one of my favourite ways to eat eggs. It's incredible. It's all about the contrast the slightly sweet simit gives to food, and even with sweet foods, it is incredible. That is too good. This is bread that has both amazing texture and flavour, and if you're looking for a way to use it, well, they'll go perfect with a Turkish breakfast.